Kimpo, it's not really a win because really what the US is doing is coming into line with the prescripts of the WTO, the Doha Declaration, which does provide a large degree of certainty and confidence to developing countries to enable them to circumvent the TRIPS regulations in the interests of public health, to then be able to produce drugs at a much diminished price. And I think we've been here before with the HIV/AIDS pandemic, when countries like South Africa and Brazil were able to successfully lobby for antiretroviral drugs for HIV from big pharmaceutical companies at the time, when it threatened Abbott and Merck and other big companies. And of course, that saved lives. I mean, at the time, I think that antiretrovirals used to cost about up to 8,000 rands per month, which is absolutely, completely prohibitive for most people. Now, what this does, though, it doesn't quite cover a few things. It covers the notion, of course, of production of the drugs, but it doesn't cover other things which are quite important on the value chain of detection, of prevention, of post-testing, and so forth. So it is only one component, which is just, producing the drugs themselves. I think another piece of that is that this really is in the context of a larger framework of bio-diplomacy, bio-racism as well, international relations, advancing health security and also health justice, right? So really what this actually means is that what has happened is that the virus has thrived on ongoing inequalities, and it's also thrived on ongoing power play, particularly between the Euro-US bloc and the global South, Africa, Latin America, South Asia, and so forth. And what this does is really it only brings the US into the bare minimum of compliance with global decency at a time when, in fact, the WTO had already given these provisions. So they're not really doing anything over and above.
Will there be any value at all in South Africa scoring a victory on the world stage when back here at home there are huge issues when it comes to legislation? What does that essentially mean for us here at home, and how we benefit from something that has been lauded outside, but internally there are still a lot of grey areas?
Yeah, there is a lot of grey. But I think what I'm hoping is that what's going to happen from this moment is that the patent waiver will be legislated and will be enacted at the South African level. I'm also hoping that the history that we have with antiretroviral drugs and the very strong pharmaceutical activism and actually community and movement activism will act as a buttress against this. So the Treatment Action Campaign, the AIDS Consortium and others. And right now, you have you have different, the Right to Know campaign. You have different campaigns which have actually been quite vociferous in their attempts to ensure that there is transparency in public legislation. And we also have, we have very strong human rights, human dignity practitioners, lawyers, activist lawyers in this country. And I think that we shouldn't get too bogged down by the idea that South Africa is somehow, inefficient and stuff, which is not true per se. I think what is true though is that what does happen is the party politics sometimes get lost in really important issues of national interest and national importance, as we have seen right now. What I do also hope is that we will be able to deal with other property rights which are included in the TRIPS waiver. So this is not just the patents. This includes, as you rightly say, how do we produce these drugs? How do we then often deal with the questions of multiple patents? And by the way, this might be held across the countries, across the borders. It might be a good opportunity for not only South Africa, but Southern Africa, SADC, for example, to take some leadership because, pharmaceutical diplomacy, vaccine diplomacy, health diplomacy, public health diplomacy, as I have said, is really an important part of our internationalism and our international relations footprint right now. It's also linked with security, unfortunately, and I would like that it doesn't become an over-securitized mechanism, which is then used to rather keep certain people out or in and privilege certain people, but rather where there can be a coherent and cohesive collection and coming together of key countries.
The request for the waiver was tabled by South Africa and India about 9 months ago. and there was support from more than 100 countries. But there was also resistance by big pharmaceutical companies, the UK and the EU. Why was that?
Well, I mean, I think that can only be ascribed to biocolonialism, and it can only be ascribed. I think I was listening to some remarks that Bill Gates was making around the cost of production, that it's impossible to develop infrastructure in different parts of the world. I don't know when he became a bio expert. I always knew him to be a laptop computer person, but there you go. But I think that kind of sentiment where you have huge bio-philanthropists and philanthrocapitalists like Gates, who are over-influencing, using their white maleness, quite frankly, to over-influence global processes at a time such as this, has been very problematic. And that's really fed into really existing. That is the way that, unfortunately, international relations work. They're not very international. They're usually skewed in favor of Euro-US nations. And this is how we can see that racism is alive and well in international relations and international power dynamics across the world. We can also see that even the original conception of the World Health Organization, which talks about the right to health, was actually drafted and conceptualized at a time when a lot of the world was not considered to be human. So this was in 1947 or so, when in fact it didn't even represent the world as we know it now. It only represented a few nations, and even the idea of it was really to do with keeping the colonies clean, keeping the people, keeping the colonialists themselves, away from infection and so forth. And that kind of mantra and mindset is what has been reproduced. There's been very little shift away from that in the last 80 years. And I don't think that we should be under any illusions that the US, Europe, and other countries in the global north, even Russia, and even China to a great extent, have any real interest in us. But what we should be aware of is, of course, our fates. What they need to be aware of course, is that our fates are inexplicably tied together. Global travel must continue. International trade must continue. And a sense of international community, which is people-based, which is ethical, must continue. And I think that this is the opportunity for African countries, in fact, to make different demands and to rethink how we want to participate in the so-called global world.
With the U.S. supporting announcing a support for the waiver, I mean, health rights groups there are really thrilled about this, really excited about it, saying that, some saying that it will be a coordinated target for the Biden-Harris administration. How then does that element factor into how significant the U.S.'s approval is in this whole process?
Well, I mean, the U.S.'s approval, unfortunately, is important only because of the kind of voice that they carry globally, and also because they also hold a lot of patents as well globally. They hold one of the biggest numbers of patents in intellectual property as a nation. They've bought out different countries. They have bought out small inventors, small creators, and so on, in a way that's quite problematic, quite imperial in and of itself. But it's kind of a masthead for all of these things to happen simultaneously and very urgently in this moment. I think the significance is also that Biden has fashioned himself as somebody who is more outward looking, although none of his pronouncements of put America first give me much encouragement in that regard. I don't see the difference between make America great and and put America first, quite frankly. But it does certainly put, some lip service into his administration's commitment, such as it is, to rejoin the international community in ways that the former administration had very little interest in doing. And lastly, I think it also then begins to put to the test their notion of what it means to be an ethical government, and to really deal with internationalism and to deal with being a state that wants to lead, because he's been talking about how America must lead, which I think is quite imperial in and of itself. But whether this leadership then includes leadership in this ethical framing on this TRIPS waiver.
Now, very lastly, just give us a sense of what the next steps are, especially considering that here at home, a few rights groups had initially they oppose the waiver, speaking about how South Africa still needs to fix this legislation to then essentially enable greater access to the drugs.
Well, I mean, I think what happens now is that even though there's greater support, you're quite right, it does need to go through a series of domestic processes. I think that's not going to be difficult at all. We also need to then think through how the Medical Research Council and other industry actors are going to participate in this and really galvanize the funding and the budget for this as well. So a realignment of resources for this. The other piece of that is that, of course, it also means that over the next 6 to 12 months, we have to see much greater physical infrastructure for this to happen in an effective way. I'm also hoping that this links to an accelerated rollout program for those who do want the vaccine and for those who are more vulnerable and so forth, that it leads to a greater rollout program. And the other piece of that is that there should be multiple options of what kind of vaccines are available as well. That's another piece of this, because I think that we have seen that there have been concerns around some of the vaccines that are already existing, strange side effects, after effects, clotting and strokes and so forth. So I think that a lot of people, easing people's minds and easing people's bioskepticism and pharma skepticism, vaccine skepticism, a huge public relations, public education drive around this is actually quite useful. So yeah, there's a longish way to go, but it has to be, we have to go through several steps in a very short space of time, given the urgency of what is happening.
Very well. Thank you so much for your time. Senior Research Fellow at Trade Collective, Ms. Lebohang Pheko, speaking there about a COVID-19 TRIPS waiver and, of course, some of the important elements that need to be understood about it.